When did you kind of figure out that you wanted to cook?
I figured out I wanted to cook professionally well, I went through two phases. One was in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. You guys were probably in diapers. But I worked in DC for a restaurant with an amazing chef, and I got seduced by food then, but it came at a time when I was pretty young and thought there were too many other things I wanted to do, and didn't see myself becoming a cook. So I'd been working in the front of the house, and then I started doing food running in the kitchen. I got a little bit of experience cooking, but before I caught the bug full on, I jumped ship, moved back to Boston, left the restaurant industry behind for a couple of years, tried my hand at advertising, and then a friend of mine called me up for a newspaper job, and said they were looking for a dining critic, so I took that job. I applied for it, I got it, started writing about restaurants and food, and so over the course of my career doing that, not only did I get sucked back into the restaurant business, but I also had to pay my karma back, because I'm writing about other people and criticizing their menus and things like that, so now I get to be on the receiving end of that.
And what publication was that for?
The Improper Bostonian.
Oh, okay, okay. So once you got back into kind of the restaurant, the food type of industry, is that when the Black Trumpet started, or was it you went and worked somewhere else?
No, Black Trumpet came along after a few more episodes or chapters. One was when I was a forager, and I was doing a lot of writing about food, and I, at this point was a freelance writer writing for magazines all around the country. And I came to Portsmouth. My grandfather lived here, my mother grew up here, and I always liked Portsmouth, but never really saw myself living here. And then I actually sat upstairs in this restaurant when it was the previous restaurant called Lindbergh's Crossing. And while we were sitting eating rabbit in the window of the restaurant I now own, my wife and I decided to move to Portsmouth, and I applied for a job the next day in this restaurant as a prep cook. And we did that for a few months, and then the owners of this restaurant opened a sister restaurant called Ciento that was a Spanish tapas restaurant, and it was just a block away from here. And I was quickly named sous chef of that restaurant. That sort of happened as a precipitous move, and I wasn't, I don't think, ready for that at that time, but I had a lot of food knowledge. I wasn't much of a cook, but I had a lot of food knowledge. So I did that for a year and a half, and then the restaurant closed, and I was without a job. I was starting to look around for jobs, and my wife got laid off. We had a 8-month-old daughter, and I knew a flamenco guitarist who had played in Ciento every Sunday, whose mother was looking for me to come down and consult on an opening of a restaurant in Mexico. And it was in a little town called San Miguel in the center of Mexico, about 2 hours north of Mexico City. And I went down to check it out, and I called my wife and said, I'm not coming home. I love it here, and I want to be here for the rest of my life. And she said, get your ass back here right now. So we packed up the car about 6 months later and moved down to Mexico with our daughter.
Wow.
And I lived there for almost 2 years. We traveled around Mexico, explored the regional cuisines of Mexico, and the restaurant I worked in the whole time I was there was a Cajun restaurant. So I was the chef of a Cajun restaurant in Mexico. Denise ran a shop next door that sold a lot of food that we prepared in the restaurant, and it was a very insane time in our lives, but it gave me a really great perspective about the value of family, about parenting, and where that balance exists for chefs who often don't have a lot of time for family. So we got a call while we were down there saying, would you like to come back and be the executive chef of Lindbergh's Crossing, which was this restaurant at that time. And that was in, that would have been 2003. And I came back. I was the executive chef here for 4 years, and bought the restaurant from the owners in 2007. Renamed it Black Trumpet after my favorite foraged mushroom, and the rest is history. 8 years have been around now, almost to the day.
So what exactly went in, because you said San Miguel, you wanted to spend the rest of your life there. What went into that decision to kind of come back to where it's cold and not as, I guess, tropical and warm and nice?
Yeah, I know, it's pretty nice down there. The decision was about family, really. It was a matter of, did we want to raise our kids in Mexico and kind of alienate, to some degree, the rest of our family here. And not only did we not want to do that, but the other job prospects that I had to advance my career down there were pretty shady. We weren't too sure about the long-term security of those. And this one was one that I knew, this was an established restaurant. Before it was Lindbergh's Crossing, it had been Blue Strawberry for 26 years. So the space is kind of its own institution, and the legacy of that we had going for us here, and it wasn't a lot of risk, quite honestly.
What was the conversation like when you bought this place from the previous owner, who I'm assuming you were relatively close with?
Oh, very much so, yeah. Still am. Yeah. And they were great guys. They had Denise and I over to dinner at their house about 3 years into it, and said there had always kind of been an understanding that if it was ever going to be sold, that we might have first refusal on that. And they said, the time has come, we're ready, and within the next year we'd like to sell and move on. And so they made their future plans, and we said we'd go ahead with it, and the rest was all, paperwork and banking and all those details, which is the least sexy part of the whole process. But we went through with it, and we hope that down the road we'll have the same sort of compassion and wisdom to, when it's our turn to pass the torch, it'll hopefully be to someone who was just as passionate as I was at the time.
And the decision to leave San Miguel was probably hard. How big of a decision was it to kind of buy this restaurant? Like you said, it was understood, and you were kind of, it was a no-brainer.
Yeah, it was kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine any other fate than the one I've just enjoyed for the last 8 years. It's not without its hardships and difficulties. Obviously, it's the restaurant business, but we've built something that's more than a restaurant, and it is really rewarding to think about the value that this has, not only in our community, but beyond.
When we were talking on the phone, I know you're big into the whole local food movement, kind of sustainability. When did you become so passionate about that? Was that before Black Trumpet, or was that right when you kind of bought the place?
It's a great question. It's one I've been thinking about a lot. I'm in the process of writing a cookbook, and the deal with the publisher is sort of dependent on my being able to tell that story of how in the last decade, essentially, the local food movement has come about, and what role Black Trumpet has played in that. And I have to say that I think at the outset of what is now considered the local food movement or the locavore movement, I was an idiot savant. I knew it was the right thing, I knew it was a good idea, but I would never have called myself one of the foremost pioneers of that idea. And I can remember a very specific scenario where another chef from our community was hosting a bunch of us for a magazine cover shot that he made a big lunch for, and then did a quick presentation. And this is a guy who's kind of shy. He doesn't do public speaking very well. And he stood up and he said that he had just prepared all of this food from ingredients that were within a 15-mile radius of where we were standing. And I thought, holy shit, that's a huge accomplishment. You're in New England. This is before we had the kind of seasonal extension that we have now. And granted, this was in the middle of summer, so it was much more doable than any of us thought at the time. But it really got my head moving in that direction of thinking not only about the wacko ingredients that I liked to use. Like, as a chef, I've always been about exploring the boundaries of ingredients, their origins, just knowing everything about where an ingredient comes from before it gets to me, but also where it came from in the greater sense, like, you know, the travel of the tomato from the Americas to Europe to the United States again. You know, that history of food and the anthropology of food is has always been a big interest of mine. But I think the turning point really was that one lunch for the now defunct Portsmouth magazine that Ted McCormick stood up and proudly demonstrated that he could cook a meal from all local food.
And then kind of, you had talked about the whole, like getting meat from local farms, just to kind of get it on the record. Where exactly do you get most of your meat from? Is it not, is it within a 15-mile radius, or?
No. Meat requires large tracts of land to graze on, and those pastures you don't find adjacent to Portsmouth. You know, you have to go a little bit farther for that. And it's interesting, you know, my journey in this process that you could argue started, you know, 8 or 9 years ago, started with working through existing broadliners, they're called, or food purveyors that were distributing originally what we now consider very irresponsibly raised meat from the Midwest primarily, well, from the West and Midwest and the Bible Belt and all of the giant, you know, packing facilities that there are in Oklahoma and Nebraska. So a lot of that meat was sort of the standard fare in restaurants in the United States for a long time. When I started asking around, you know, the questions, when I started asking our purveyors, you know, where the meat came from, the first answer was, we have no idea. You know, and imagine that today, like, no one would ever say that, because no chef would tolerate that answer. So at that time, I didn't tolerate the answer, and I kept digging, and I would say, well, if you can't tell me where the meat comes from, then I don't want it. And as soon as you start looking at losing business, then that's when you start paying attention to the source of the food. So I started working with Dole & Bailey out of Woburn, Massachusetts, and they could do a little bit better than, you know, this awful meat coming from these large packing houses. And same with pork, like the CAFO pork or the container-raised pork that is still a standard, sadly, in the U.S. I started, you know, saying, I don't want to get pork from there, so where else can I get pork from? And pretty soon, Dole & Bailey came up with a pretty good solution at that time, which was called New England Family Farms. And it was a cooperative of farms who were raising their meat to certain standards, partially grass-fed, some finished on corn. You know, good. At least I knew what it was and where it was coming from. So I could put that on my menu, which I did. And I said, we proudly serve neff beef, which started a conversation between our guests and our servers. And our servers were all well educated at this point in knowing that this matters, you know, and why it matters. So that step was to Northeast Family Farms, and my next step was after I built a reputation for buying local food, people started coming in with samples of meat from local farms. And this one guy from Archer Angus in, I think it's a Chesterville, Maine. So that's a couple hours away, but it was an amazing quality product, and it was a grass-fed Angus beef with like beautiful marbling, and it was a great step between what I consider bad meat and what I consider good, responsible meat, because it bridged the taste evaluation that we all have. Grass-fed meat tastes different. It's not as tender, it's not as fatty, and it doesn't taste like corn, you know? So some people will taste grass-fed meat and think it's not as good. And so we had to go through that process with our guests of sort of easing them into the idea of grass-fed through the Archer Angus program. After I'd worked with them for many years, I was approached just this last year by a woman named Carol Sewell, and her farm, Miles Smith Farm in Loudon, New Hampshire, raises Longhorn, Scottish Highlander cattle, and she does a few other breeds as well. But they're wholly committed